So welcome, thank you very much for coming along to this workshop. It'll be half presentation, half workshop. Come on, don't leave it. That was working just now, what's happened? I do apologise. Let's start again. So, welcome to the workshop. And just for a moment, I'd like you to take a look at the picture here and just sort of picture back to your time at work and think about a time that a colleague has made you feel like this. Something that they've done that has given you this kind of sensation. Kind of, why did they do that sort of a feeling? I'm sorry to traumatise you with this, but has anyone got one they would like to share? Or would you rather just suffer in silence and pretend it didn't happen? Does anybody recognise this feeling, though? Yep, I see nods and hands. So I empathise, if I could say it. That was me too. Just once too often, actually, in many years as a software developer, more than I care to count. I added up the other day, it seemed to be coming out at 3 decades. So I stopped counting at that point. So that same question, why did they do that? I asked myself many times over quite a long career. Not quite such a long career that goes back to punch cards, but I am old enough that my older sister, her first job was actually typing out punch cards. But nonetheless, in software development commercially for 20 years, and got to that question where I just had to go off and study psychology and try and answer that question a bit. So I stopped being a developer, went and studied psychology, had a whole new load of psychological things to add to my toolkit, and still had that itch and that question about what's going on with software developers. Because I was working with some very clever and capable people. They could write programs that would work absolutely fine. There was nothing wrong with them. They cared quite often about how they did things. And yet sometimes you'd pick up a piece of work and it was an absolute breeze to get on and use it. And other times it was just a nightmare and more difficult than you'd have anticipated it would be. And there was a distinct fingerprint to people's work. And given that they were professional people who cared about what they were doing, I was really curious about that difference between them. So, having studied psychology and the itch hadn't gone away, I did some PhD research in that area, passed my Viva this January, hooray. So I now stand before you as Dr. Ollis, or strictly speaking, I will do once I've graduated, but near enough. And how to apply what the things I learned from that research was very much my raison d'etre with that, because I didn't want to just go do a bit of academic research and stick it on a shelf in a very prettily bound thesis and be done with it. I came to that as a practicing developer who wanted to help other developers. So I approached that research in 3 parts. I'm going to tell you about those because I think there might be something in it that could be of practical use to you. The first thing I did was talk to a lot of experienced developers. So not novice developers, because not the problems novices have with other people's work could be to do with the fact that they're just not very experienced yet. There are going to be things that are new to you and confusing because they're new and confusing, not because there's anything wrong with them. So I spoke to people with a combination between them of 400 years of experience as developers, 28 people altogether, so that's quite a lot of experience, to get their definition of that. So why did they do that? What is that? Just my own experience is not really adequate foundation for a bit of PhD research, right? So I wanted a better picture of what that is before I could move on and figure out what to do from there. So what? If I've got this definition from people of what that is that other people do, to actually be able to do something useful with it rather than it just being the worst a thesis on a shelf, at best a new dictum of good practice that people can cite but not do anything with. I wanted to actually change people's practice. So I took material from that initial interview phase and ran some workshops so that people could share their experience and help get those issues recognised more widely within their team. And that's what we'll be doing in the workshop section later. So I'd also like to tell you how did those workshops go? What feedback did I get? So it'll give you some idea of whether or not it might be useful to you in your own company. Spoiler alert, if it was being a complete and utter disaster, I wouldn't be standing here in front of you talking about it. I'd just be sitting at the back of somebody else's talk right now. So I do want to share with you how it went. So that's the structure of what I'm going to do today. Let's start off talking about those interviews. So I did these one-to-one with, like I say, experienced developers. And I started off by asking them that open question, pretty much similar to the guy with his head in his hands. Sort of, what do other people do that affects what you do? I mean, not necessarily bad things. It could be things that they do that have really helped your work as well. But also, what have they done that have slowed you down, made your life more difficult? And that's okay. That takes you only so far, though, because if you're asking people to remember things like that, you'll be affected by recency. So it'll be something that happened last week, for example, rather than something that happened several months ago. Unless it was something particularly emotionally strong, and then that will ensure, well, not ensure, but it will increase the likelihood of you remembering that. And there's still instances that I remember from years ago, but there are a lot of the more minor ones I would remember if it was last week, but I wouldn't remember from across the years. So I wanted to get a better spread of that and make sure I prompted them to think about further back and across the years, but also across the whole spread of things that developers do. Because it's not just coding, right? There's the whole build and test and talking to others and bug reports and I probably missed some already. Bug fixing, all sorts in there, right? Some of my particular pet hates at the time were state machines. I used to work with somebody who had a state machine shaped hammer and thought, therefore, everything should be solved with everything was a nail for that state machine. He was also a great copy and paste merchant. I think at the last count that I ever did, it was something like 12 copies of basically the same thing with a tiny change between them. Absolute nightmare. And yes, I did have to change all 12 of those in the stuff that I was doing. So, those are the kind of things that I'd noticed and remembered, just because of the sheer extent of frustration. But I wanted to get the breadth of other topics. So, I gave them some cards to sort, the whole A6 cards, with various behaviours on, tries to leave a module a bit better than when they checked it out, for example, the Boy Scout principle, with some examples on there, and got them to sort those according to that personal impact. So not about, is this good practice? Is this recommended by a particular guru? Is it in the book somewhere? But how does it affect, very personal thing, how does it affect me? I hate it when Neil does state machines when there shouldn't be a state machine, for example. State machines, it turns out, are not really all that big a deal. It's just, it's one of those things, when you hit one where it shouldn't be one, it's kind of, yeah. But it didn't really slow me down that much, because you can see it's a state machine, right? But it's, irritating. So that one turned out to be just an irritant. So I was asking them, how does it affect me? And I kept reminding them, and asking them on gut feel as well, your instant reaction rather than, it depends, and thinking about it. So I asked them to sort them according to whether they were neutral, so it doesn't have much impact on me one way or the other, or good with a slight impact. So it helps me a little bit, it makes, went to do something and it was a little bit easier than I thought. Good, noticeable impact. Maybe it's something that you thought was going to be a couple of days' work, but somebody structured something so well, done it with such a good configuration, turns out to be a really easy job to do. Or they've documented it really well, or they've got a good test for it, whatever. So things that really speed you along, like you're sort of freewheeling downhill with it. Okay, into each silver line, or around each silver lining, there has to be a cloud, right? So there has to be the other side of that. The bad slight impact, that's the kind of thing where you hit it and it gives you a little bit of a trip, it's a bit odd, or it's a bit of odd naming, or a slightly tangled structure or something, but it only slows you down a little. You can figure out fairly quickly what's going on. You just stumbled a little bit on the way and then, I see. And finally, the worst of all, the bad noticeable impact ones. So these are the ones where maybe you thought it was going to be a half-hour job and it turns out to be 2 days or longer or completely impossible. Oh, yeah, okay, so you know what those ones feel like, right? So I had them categorised into these, not to give me a quantitative number for it so much of the labels of these, but so that we could then follow it up with them and talk about those. So we looked at the good noticeable impact ones, the very best peer behaviours, and the bad noticeable impact ones, the really worst, and talked about why those were and what the impact is. So we really got into that impact of them rather than, so it's not about performance or number of bugs that get caused or any of those other good things, all of which are important, right? Or I don't know, security, whatever, lots of usability, lots of important principles out in there. But this was a chance for them, it was really kind of nice one-to-one therapy for them, actually. I think they quite enjoyed the experience. Maybe actually what I should do is just go out and do one-to-one therapy for developers, because I understand what they're saying to me, so I can listen meaningfully and nod and sympathise and share anecdotes and say, yes, I know too, but it's what you're going to do. So they talked about those things. We explored why, and I took themes out of what they said in the subsequent analysis. So, although I said I wasn't doing this particularly for the numbers of which cards are which, because that just gives you a headline thing. It doesn't tell you why it's a good or bad thing. It just tells you they think it's a good or bad thing. Nonetheless, the ones that came out best and worst on that are interesting, and naturally the ones we talked about, because we talked about the ones that went in those extremes of the piles. So this was the very top, this one. 89% of people put this into the good noticeable impact heap. And they mentioned that it does mean you can do things at the touch of a button. So if somebody sets something up, you don't have to go do a whole load of manual tasks. It just happens. But also they talked about it in terms of it being executable documentation. So if you've documented your process in the form of a script that will go and do it for you, you know with some certainty that documentation of it is correct. Anyone ever had to go refer to a Word document of how to do the build or how to do whatever process, and then it's out of date? Yep. Yeah. So the script could be, but you'll know if it's completely utterly broken and there's a step missing, you will know because it will not run. You can't do that. The only way you can run that with a Word document is go through it step by step, and then you don't know if you did it wrong or missed a bit. With a script, you know exactly where you are. In a way, as executable documentation, that's communicating some information you have, right? It's a way of storing all the knowledge you have about how to do that particular process. And so is this one, a very similar thing. This is also about communicating the information that you have in your hand at the time you're doing the stuff yourself. So if you include the symptoms and how to reproduce it in the bug report, the person raising that is in the best position to have that information. Are they sharing it? Because somebody picking this up, now who is on this? Yes, somebody yesterday actually at my early careers tutorial was talking about the importance of putting that kind of stuff in your bug reports, right? Because the person raising it is the one who's got that information in their hand. They've got to be sharing it. And if you're just picking that up and there's not enough information in there, you've got to go do a whole load of legwork, more legwork generally, because you're not already in that context to figure out what's going on. So again, sharing information that you've got. This one is rather the opposite. This is hiding information that you've got, pasting over the cracks. So you've got a bug, you know what's going on, well, you've got to some level, you know what's going on there. But if you just go fixing the symptoms without really understanding why, the next person to come along and do this hasn't got that information about where it got stuck, where things went wrong. They've moved that to somewhere, some great distance away from where it was in the first place, potentially, because something will still go wrong, right? It just won't go wrong in that place, and it'll be that much harder for you to trace it back. So, very much a case of hiding information, that one, apart from all the other things that are wrong with it. In terms of professionalism, it's pretty bad, but in terms of impact on others, that's lots of information. So here's another one that's about sharing your knowledge again, is good at helping others. So this is, I think, a fairly self-explanatory one. If you need to find something out from someone, or if you need to figure out how to do something, you don't want them to be scratchy and prickly and unapproachable. You want them to share their knowledge willingly and freely with you. Actually, at the moment, I have a student who does exactly that with a very, very capable programmer, very much helping out people who don't know programming as well. I've just started afresh this academic year and is absolutely selfless in sharing his knowledge. So give him a little hat tip there. Willing to discuss suggestions about their code. So this is being willing not only to give information, but to receive it from others, to listen and receive help. So they're not dogmatic about it must be done this way. They're willing to accept that the way they've done it isn't the only true way, and you can have a discussion with them about how it might be done. Somewhat in contrast to this one, espouses one true way. No, this is the way to do it. And this was some of the most vexing ones in a way in my career. That's sort of, we know there are good ways to do things, and there are principles, and sometimes people would latch onto one of those from some point in their career, and that is now the way to do it. So very much unwilling to listen to other ways of doing it, because this is the right way. This was the great way that was approved by whichever guru in whichever decade. And it's not necessarily a bad motivation, right? They're caring about how they do it, and that's great. We like them to be caring about what they're doing. I wasn't at least bit interested in this research in behaviour of people who just kind of turn up. Well, there are some, right? Turn up, do their job, go home. It's not a craft for them, it's just a job. So the motivation behind One True Way isn't bad, but it's rather an obstacle to listening and sharing and agreeing a joint way forward for software which is, after all, not the property of that one person. Sometimes these are the same ones who tend to own code. Again, I mean, my interviewees talked about some good sides of this, about taking responsibility, taking ownership. So again, caring about the work. There's some elements of good motivation in there sometimes, but also about being possessive and defensive and nobody else being allowed to touch that bit, which, apart from making it very difficult for anyone else to understand it when they need to integrate with it and work with it, also gives you a dreadful, depending on whether you're a pessimist or an optimist, a bad truck number or a bad lottery number. The number of people who have to be either run over by a truck or win a massive lottery and leave the job for you to be in a really bad way. So if you've got somebody who owns code and won't let anyone else near it, then you're going to have a bad... I'm going to go with truck number. I'm in a pessimistic mood, right? Because maybe they'll stay on with if they win the lottery as well, just at least long enough to get somebody else to understand the code. So again, this is very much about not listening, in that they're not willing to let other people into that code to share their ideas. Also seen in people who work in isolation. Now, the worst case I ever saw of this was somebody who worked away in a corner. Goodness knows how this was allowed to happen, right? These things don't happen in isolation themselves. There's always a context. This guy worked away in a corner for 3 months on his machine, checking nothing in. 3 months, I kid you not. On a machine which, little did he know, was not backed up. So, boy, were we lucky with that. He was a contractor as well, so he was a fairly expensive person working in a corner. So, it's a pretty extreme case. But there are these people who go and work away in a corner, don't want to talk about it, they just go disappear, do their own thing. And they seem very productive, and probably management love them because they'll churn out reams of code just sitting there doing stuff. But I reckon the 10 times programmer is actually the one who creates 10 times as much work for everyone else. I think that's the only way they exist. So this person is very likely to reinvent the wheel. They're not talking to other people. They're not having those conversations. They're not finding out from others what already exists in the system or what others have done. They're going to go and do things potentially in a way that doesn't fit the local approach because they haven't socialised their ideas. They may well have found some whizzing new framework that they think seems really cool and ideal for this purpose. So they go and introduce a whole new bit of knowledge needed into the code base without consulting the rest of the team. So it's then a bit of a surprise, shall we call it, for the people that are expected to work around that result when they finally encounter that and discover what has been added to their code base. So, yeah, they're not wildly popular, I have to say, with my participants. So, to give you some idea, my participants came out with some beautiful expressions describing these scenarios. And one of them had a colleague who described like this: I saw him create a legacy system in 3 weeks. And he's got a point there, right? It's all legacy of a sort, however good or bad it is. As soon as some time has passed and something is sat there, there's some stickiness, some resistance to change to it. There might be a certain amount of wiggle room, especially if it's caught earlier on. But you are constrained by decisions that have been made around you to fit in with those and work with that. So it doesn't just have to be old stuff to be legacy. It can, as you can see in this case, this is clearly a particularly bad example of writing new stuff, but you're constrained by anything that happens around you. On the opposite side, rather more cheerfully, is willing to ask questions. This was a popular one. This is very much the opposite person, no ego about it. Their priority is getting it right, and they're willing to coordinate with others to do it. I think the interesting thing about this one is that it's popular with people in terms of the impact on them. So somebody who wants to ask questions is going to be coming up to you and interrupting you and taking your time away from the task you were trying to get on with, right? So this could be taken to the extreme and not done with care, and just asking about every little thing would be annoying. But actually people are saying it's good when people do this because they're socialising their ideas. So this is why it was so important, right, to be having a discussion about why this card, because otherwise you go, well, why is this a good thing? So even though it's eating into your own precious time, it's saving you in the long run because they're talking to you, what they're doing is making sense. When that all comes back together into the system, it's going to hang together and work. It's not going to add an extra cognitive load onto the rest of the team. So it's important that they're having that, creating that shared understanding. So that's a good thing. That was an interesting and I think sort of slightly surprising one, given that it was asking for such a self-centred, in a way, opinion on it, perspective. So one last card I'd like to share from that set. Chooses identifiers which are not succinct, meaningful, and distinct. So this one card was very much the odd one out. All the others are much more about the communication and the infrastructure around it. The ones I could remember when I went into this were those silly little things like state machines and copy and paste to a degree. Copy and paste came out more, actually. People did speak about dry. But this one was the only one in the fine level details of the code. So I had stuff about layout and brackets and density of nesting in conditionals and all sorts of nitty-gritty bits like that. And some of those were indeed things that had a bad, slight impact. But bear in mind, these are all experienced programmers. So they know the syntax inside out. They're really well versed in reading code. They're probably very practiced, they are very practiced in reading bad code, right? So it might be a bit, what the hell are they doing here? Oh, I see, rather than, oh, I see what they're doing here. And so that's a slight bump in the road, but nothing too drastic. This one, though, if the identifiers aren't right, you can see what's happening to it in terms of things being passed from one thing to another and being iterated over whatever, but you don't know what on earth they are. So, anyone heard of Noam Chomsky? Yeah, so do you know that phrase, what was it? Colourless green ideas sleep furiously, right? Perfectly grammatical, perfectly syntactically valid, and utterly, totally meaningless. Make no sense at all out of colourless green ideas sleep furiously. I think that's a pretty good parallel to what happens with code when the identifiers are bad. It can't be ambiguous syntactically because, well, it's code, right? That's why we have it. That's why we write it in Java or Python or whatever. Sorry, C++, I ought to mention C++. Rather than in English or French or whatever. But in terms of documenting the information you have, those identifiers are really important. They tell you what the verbs are that are happening to those nouns. And if you haven't described the noun and the verb, then it's really hard to figure out what is happening. You can figure out the grammar, but not the semantics of it. Actually, I tell a lie when I say this was the only one that came out in the low-level details of the code. The other one that came out here as a thing people talked about a lot was comments. But I was looking here for consensus and themes in what people said. That is most definitely not something I got with comments. I got everything from, I have my editor set up so they're displayed in white on white, all the way through to, even if they're a bit out of date, they're still a bit of a clue, better than nothing. So no sense of consensus there at all. It's very, in fact, probably fairly polarised, actually. It's not much of a continuum between them. It's basically pretty much useless, or you really need them, and no help at all in helping me assess what was a consensus. There just wasn't one. And I've spotted that one as a distinct can of worms that would derail my PhD entirely. So I went, okay, that one's not consensus, and moved on. So, talking about identifiers, some of the popular things that people mentioned, themes. Because, yeah, it's hard thinking up variable names, right? So if you've got a theme, you've got a whole load to draw on. So let's call all our variables after vegetables, like broccoli, carrots, peas or whatever. Or completely meaningless ones, like wibble. I don't know if they're all that easy to think up, but they're certainly not easy to figure out the meaning of. Whimsical ones as well. I think one of the most grating and vomit-inducing ones I heard of was somebody who'd written, they cited someone, let's see, ickle instead of little. And yeah, they're not quite so icky, but still not very useful. Let's see, blue. Something was defined as blue, and there was a variable called moon, and things happened once in a blue moon, basically. If moon is blue, do this thing. It's just, you can kind of figure out what it means, but there's an extra level of abstraction in that. And yeah, I'm sure it seemed amusing at the time, but it isn't when you're trying to fix a customer problem at 3 a.m. So, yeah, they also came. So this is one of the things that was a big issue for all the interviewees, the identifiers. They also had very colourful metaphors for that problem of ploughing through somebody else's work, the struggle of that, the sort of wading through treacle feeling. This was my absolute favourite quote from this one. So then someone's written their own code and reinvented the wheel and added an elephant onto it and a spaceship. So yeah, it's just going and playing and having fun and getting carried away rather than doing actually what's needed in there. So that picture that emerged from the cards, even though I had a lot in there about the fine details, so about half of them, if you look through these, you'll find about half of them are about the nitty-gritty coding bit. But actually, apart from the identifiers, the picture that emerged was a less fine-grained thing. So these things aren't unimportant, but they're just a small trip. Very few topics were actually neutral. And the things that did matter were about the sharing of information, the communication, that kind of thing. So, all well and good. Got some themes out of that, did some nice qualitative analysis, got some interesting quotes out of it. I've written that bit up. So what? What does that mean to you, right? No use me being an academic rather than a software developer. How can we actually use this to alleviate those problems? We know now for quite a lot of people, and people with enough experience to be a pretty reliable source on this, that these things are problems. What can we do to try and help with that? So, because they'd come up with some really nice phrases to describe this that really kind of captured the nature of the issues, and they'd really liked the card sorting format, that there was something nice and tangible about that, about being able to pick it up and sort of read it and go, sort of mull it over a little bit, but still going with gut instinct. And sometimes you could see them sort of literally all go, yeah, that one goes there. They seem to enjoy that process. So I combined those two, put together some workshops in which developers as a team could discuss those issues. So, for example, this one, a lot of times I find people are more driven by the latest technologies than by understanding the problem. The shiny new toy problem, right, where somebody introduces into your code base something that's really not ready for yet, because it's really not a good time to be suddenly everybody else having to deal with this thing. I mean, they also talked about this as being, this one particular one, as mattering differently at different times in the life cycle of the product. So if you're about to ship, you really don't want this one. If you're just starting on a project, then maybe this is one that you could do, but you should be discussing it, not just doing it sitting in a corner. So they were very eloquent about the issues. They'd liked the cards. So what I did was take the quotes that matched the themes that had come out, rather than just giving people a list of themes and saying, here are themes, here are issues. You guys don't do these bad things, do these good things, right? Okay, sorted, go away and do that. Make it so. And it's completely pointless. It would make no difference at all. So I've taken the quotes some quotes that represent those themes, printed them on double-sided A4, and used them as a basis for discussion. So, because these are themes that come from my research, right, this is 400 years of experience on here, it's not your local people. I'm not asking you to say, Alex, I hate it when you do this. It's dreadful when you do that. Right? I don't have to do that. I say, this card is an issue because when this thing happens, I find, pretty much like these people in the research did, that this is the problem. So it takes away some of the baggage of having a meeting where you say, what are our issues? Because it's not, well, to some extent, it can be personal in that everyone might know who a particular individual is who does this kind of thing. But it's also about talking about why it matters. So it's not just the thing, it also follows through into that the concept. It's the why is that concept why does that matter? So I've tested that workshop process with groups at some of the companies who helped me initially with the interviews, and also at some new companies, because I wanted to be sure it wasn't just that people who'd already worked with me kind of got it, and everyone else would go, hey, what? And I'm pleased to say that wasn't the case. They all liked it. So I had people in groups of 4 to 7 at their workplace come into a room where I had cards spread out on the table. So they'd come in, and that was actually sort of fairly intriguing, kind of what is this all about? There's something about these tangible artifacts, right, that sort of make this different to sitting in front of a computer, especially if you're normally sitting in front of a computer. And I asked them to spend 5 or 10 minutes, no limit on it, but just spend some. In fact, I asked them to spend some time, and it tended to be 5 or 10 minutes, to ask themselves, how does this affect me? That same very personal question for them. And as they looked through them, there was a stage that I recognised after a while, after several of these workshops, where they'd be sifting through them, and then suddenly they'd pounce and they'd grab one of the cards, with a very distinctive, oh yeah, that one, I recognise that one. So it clearly related to their own experience, just as it did to the people whose material had helped create them. Having chosen, I asked them to explain their choice, in turn, going around the table. So everybody gets a choice, their own unique choice from the cards, and then everyone gets a say to explain why that thing helps them or hinders them in their job. And there are rules for that, 3 rules for the discussion. I've brought my little rule reminder props along, should you get bored and want to play with a plastic cow or a bit of Lego steamroller. So, the cow, my sacred cow. One of the rules for discussion, no good practice dogma. No, I've chosen this one because it's a good practice, or so-and-so recommends it, or it's cited in such and such a book, and or everybody knows, or even it's a thing from 97 Things Every Programmer Should Know. Wonderful book though it is. It's got to be about how does it affect me? Explain what it does to you. Because other people's mileage might vary, right? They might have a different experience of it. So if it is different, you need to explain why. So that's scope then for discussion. I'm afraid, What's that cow? It's my sacred cow. No sacred cow is allowed. Okay? The next one's terrible. I do apologise for this one. So the donkey, or ass, is there because there would be no assumptions. I do apologise. I'd like to blame Chris Oldwood for that one, but it wasn't actually his fault. So, no assuming that it's obvious that this is a good thing. It's similar to the dogma, right? Obvious this is good, obvious this is bad. No, explain why. Again, might be different to what somebody else experiences. If it is, there's your opportunity to have a discussion about what it is that's the problem and help somebody understand why they shouldn't do that, or actually why you should do that, and explore those differences between you. And also, finally, the steamroller. No steamrolling over other people. So this is people recounting their own experience. This is them answering the question, how does this affect me? So if your mileage varies, fair enough, explain why. But you cannot be wrong about your own experience. For example, if you hate being on the receiving end of state machines, you hate being on the receiving end of state machines. Doesn't mean state machines shouldn't be in there, but the fact that you hated it every time you hit one, is still true. I am over it, really, honestly. It doesn't sound like it, does it? Okay, so those are the rules. So, finally, having had that discussion, well, actually, no, it's not quite all rainbows and unicorns. I would have liked there, in hindsight, 2020 hindsight, I would have liked there to be follow-up on this, built into the process. Some means of capturing what they'd discussed, what they'd agreed on. In fact, the feedback I got from one group was, oh, it would be nice if you'd taken notes for us. And they're conducting research, not as your secretary, but nonetheless, there wasn't a process in there that goes, okay, let's take this forward and do something. It could just feel like one of those, well, that happened, let's move on with it, sort of thing. So it would have been nice to have something, I think, that helped them to take it forward. But it did achieve its aim of testing a method for promoting discussion about the behaviours of others, the impact that it has. And it clearly showed up some useful stuff, the very fact that people were asking for some taking it forward notes or process and materials tells you that it wasn't just a pointless discussion. It had some useful stuff in it. They just needed a bit of impetus to do it. I'm kind of sad that they didn't feel they could do that themselves, but there you go. I could have helped them a little on the way. So, did it work? Well, my observations were that they really did talk to each other about their own stuff. They would start off by addressing themselves to me as the researcher, but it very soon became a team discussion that I was just observing. Occasionally asking, well, what could you do about that then? So I was facilitating it a little, but they were taking those cards and relating them to their specific things. They'd often bring up the names of a local component or well-known issue, discuss those specific local problems, and even identified some that they could actually solve. So, for example, in the very first workshop I had, somebody said, there are ways of dealing with this, and we're not doing them. Right? So it's not that it's insoluble. In some cases, there were issues that were very structural about the context of the business, a big existing architecture, things they didn't feel able to change. And to be fair, probably couldn't, actually. Maybe there's something they could have done to mitigate it, but they were kind of constrained in what they could do. But in other cases, they went, actually, we could do a whole load better on this. There's simple ways of doing it, and we're not doing it. So the very fact that they were having that discussion between themselves was great, and identifying real local problems as it applied to, and then also coming up with solutions, said to me that it was working quite nicely. I came out, I have to say, bouncing from the first workshop when they said this. So, how did the participants think it went? I asked them immediately afterwards, and also a month later, what they thought about the process, and also would they recommend it, how would they use it again, and so on. And I asked them later so they'd had a bit of time for it to sink in. So like I said, spoiler alert, if it had been a total disaster, I wouldn't be here. And actually the only thing I'd change is that taking it forward bit. So I'd like to share with you what they said, so you can see if you think this might be useful for you. So I asked them would they recommend it. Look at that, 96%. 96% of them say, yes, please. Let's get other people to do this. And they said that in the immediate follow-up feedback and following up a month later. So why? Well, it did stimulate those interesting discussions. We could see them having those discussions. I could see them having those discussions within the team. Things that they said they were not usually or traditionally talking about. Now, these were actually pretty good, healthy teams. I did also do some measures to establish that, and clearly they were in talking to them. So they weren't dysfunctional teams who weren't already talking. What they weren't doing was having these particular discussions. It seemed like they were having the day-to-day firefighting, solve this immediate problem, what's the thing right in front of us. But even though they were agile teams, they're not capturing that in any retrospective fashion. Again, I think that was looking back over what happened last time and how can we prevent it in the next time, but not looking at that bigger umbrella picture, maybe. So definitely, you don't get invited in to do these kind of things, I don't think, in dysfunctional companies or teams. It'd be really interesting to follow up and try this on bad teams, but who's going to invite me in? I think dysfunctional teams wanted for a research study. Yeah. Who's going to sign up? Right? I think there are probably subtler ways of doing it than that, but it'll be an interesting issue to try and get invited in. I think you probably need some more help from the levels above in a company to get in and do that. So this kind of encapsulates that business of focusing on the immediate work in front of you. And, there are lots of workarounds going on. One team I talked to, from a distributed team actually, who came together in one place for a quarterly chat, is they're talking about the immediate issues in front of them, and they're not looking at that bigger picture of how to go about it. And they had they had a really weird issue with their tooling, all sorts of workarounds that people were doing to do it. So like occasionally, like weekly deleting some files, so it seemed to work better if you did that, or daily doing some other, I don't know, dancing counterclockwise around the coffee machine or something, I don't know, all sorts of stuff they were doing to work around the fact that they were using. I think it's because they were using Visual Studio on Macs, something like that. And I said, okay, well, this is tooling, right? You can choose your tooling to actually work for you, couldn't you? They were so busy just firefighting that, they hadn't stepped back and said, what can we do about it? Do we actually have to be using this? And they said, no, we can't change it. Why not? It's like they were institutionalized by this stuff. So actually they did go away and buy a Windows machine for somebody while they were there gathering, because it was cheaper where they were meeting than where it would have been in the home country for that person. And I'm going to try that out. So that's good news. Okay, would they reuse it? Not quite so enthusiastic for reusing it, but I think there was some sense in there of, kind of been there and we've done that and we've had that discussion. We don't need to do that again amongst some of those, which is a bit of a shame because for a start, I'm pretty sure some follow-up would help. And also maybe it's something you'd want to do on a, not too frequent, but you'd want to do again, maybe at yearly intervals. One company did suggest they'd like to do this kind of thing as a way of helping bring new people into the team, catch people up with the ethos that they were in, and just generally have a sort of annual review of their practices, just almost an annual stock take of it. But they did come up with reasons why they would reuse it as well. So again, back to that process of the bigger picture and the umbrella picture of it. As a team, we have no rituals which attempt to improve consistency. So they have rituals to go, what went wrong, what should we do next time? But not anything in the process that says, okay, let's take that wider view. So, like I say, they claim to be agile, which of course covered an absolute multitude of different actual practices. But they all wanted to improve their practice. Despite wanting to improve their practice and working within some sensible principles, all felt they lacked a process to actually help them achieve that this seemed to help them with. So, a few other things that were either suggested to them or asked about. They suggested that they'd like to do this with other teams. So, they were, as I said, they were quite communicative, open teams, already willing to talk to each other, just hadn't got the process to spark off as a catalyst for these conversations particularly. But several said where they've got issues with communication with other teams, this would be a nice way to open up understanding and communication between them, because they're already pretty healthy communicating teams themselves. I also asked on the feedback forms about other uses such as appraisal. So someone suggested, yes, maybe as a checklist, as a point of focus, so rather than considering just output, looking at how you think about things. I also asked them about recruitment. Would it help with that? So again, some enthusiasm for that. So not everybody was involved in recruitment, so couldn't comment on this. But they suggested it helped get insights into how an interviewee would fit. So if they've got different opinions about these things, and were just not consistent with what the team feels is important, don't rate those things important, or rate other things as important that didn't fit in with the team, then that would be an interesting insight. Also, a way of finding out how they're thinking, what's going on, what do they think, rather than it being driven by your questions, give them a choice of these things. So choice is a thing that they don't normally get very much of in an interview, right? You come along, you ask them your question, and that may or may not have some relevant stuff in their experience they can talk about. Whereas if you give them a set of cards expressing behaviours that are important to you as a company, but then let them choose, that gives you some idea of which ones they prioritise, which ones are of particular interest to them, and one that they can actually sensibly talk about. It also, because of where these come from, says this isn't just about us telling you there's a right answer, shows them that you're open to discussion and willing to take their view on board some more. So I haven't yet managed to try it with interviews, but I've got somebody lined up to give it a go when they get a chance. So, I'd like to offer you an invitation. If you recognise this feeling, and you're interested by these, and you'd like to try them out, then please do. I have got them online at the Bournemouth University Research Data Repository thingy, which you can see has not been going very long because this is number 18 on that. So I got in early with that one. And if you'd like to have a look at the cards, I've got both sets here.